fictional stories have the capacity to reveal truths that sometimes can't be talked about or explored in the real world. And certainly the novel 1984 is an opportunity or a platform for George Orwell to make some commentary about the world in which he lives. The other thing that I want to talk to you about before we start our tutorial is this notion of narratives, and that there are many narratives in our world, and that you could say that a lot of our lives are dictated by narratives that are controlled by people in positions of power. And so if we think about capitalism, for example, there is a narrative in our world that capitalism is good, and it's something that we are born into and that we're very unquestioning about. And so the purpose often of a novel is, or of any fictional text, is to challenge the assumptions that we have, and a way in which that might happen is by placing us in an uncomfortable environment. So this novel really challenges us by shocking us. We are expecting a narrative and we're expecting a story that's going to follow your traditional sort of narrative scope, but we find that that doesn't happen, and that the hero of the story is an anti-hero, and his ending is quite shocking. It's abrupt and shocking, and as a result it forces us to think about uncomfortable truths, and it makes us question our own values and our own assumptions about the world. And certainly that's a great focus for us when we're looking at the human experience. Okay, we know the novel 1984 is a story about life under a totalitarian regime. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't lived through a totalitarian regime, but there are things that I am able to identify with. This notion of powerlessness, of being fearful, of being in a position where my ideas have been suppressed, or I have this feeling of oppression. I can relate to the desire that the characters in the story have for love, or for personal connection, and also for rebellion. There are, and freedom's another thing we can talk about, this desire for freedom, and that it feels to me like an innate quality. So there are all these aspects of the novel that we can identify with, and essentially what we're trying to do in this study is look at the fictional story and have that experience within that story, and learn some truths and some morals, and have some ideas thrown around. And then what we really want to do is we want to reflect on our own personal situation, and apply some of the thinking to our own life experience, to our own world. George Orwell, he had a number of purposes. Certainly he wanted to warn readers about the dangers of extremist political ideas. He was living in a time where he was watching characters like Stalin and Hitler and Franco in Spain, etc., etc., implementing quite radical and extreme political ideologies. He wanted to warn of the dangers of loss of personal freedoms and personal autonomy. He also wanted to challenge our assumptions about love and freedom and the narratives in our world. There are lots and lots of purposes, but certainly we want to think of the novel as a warning to readers about the dangers of this, that and the other. Okay, it is described sometimes as a cautionary tale. And when we think about the form of the novel, which we'll get to soon, it is certainly set up in that realm, that it is meant to be a warning, a cautionary tale. So the context of when George Orwell was writing the novel was that the novel's called 1948. The novel was actually published in 1949, but certainly, obviously he was writing it still in 48. And it is a reflection of post-World War II Europe. So World War II had finished in 1945. And so the novel is emerging out of the Second World War and you know, looking into what's coming after that. So originally, well, you know, Orwell was thinking about the idea of calling the novel The Last Man Standing in Europe, but he decided to call it 1948 to broaden the appeal of the novel, because yes, this was happening in Europe, but it was happening elsewhere in the world, and it was a universal sort of concern, not unique to Europe. So the novel is not about the year 1948. It's 1984. It's more about 1984 representing a climate of terror and fear due to a extreme political climate. That's the notion of it. So in the 1940s we see these extreme political ideologies like fascism, communism, totalitarianism. In Russia, in the USSR, there were the Moscow show trials, and essentially people were rounded up for expressing any criticism of Joseph Stalin, and they had these show trials where they were executed. So it established a climate of fear, and that's pretty much common for these governments in the 1940s. It was also after World War II, the Cold War era followed, and there was an anxiety about the nuclear war, and there had been bombs let off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in 1945, and there was this threat of war between the two world superblocks, and Orwell's capturing that in there being three realms and in the world, in his world, and we're focused on Oceania. Okay, so you know, there is a climate of fear. People have come out of war and they're exhausted. They're sort of moving into a political world of extremism, of totalitarian control, and as a result of that, people are sacrificing and giving up, whether it's willingly or not, their freedoms in this climate. Okay, so once we've established all that, we want to talk about form. Okay, what we want to do is say this is a novel. He chose to write as a novel and rather than direct a film or write a drama. And so we want to think about the big functions of the novel. You can get down to the nitty-gritty of similes and metaphors, and that's okay. But let's start with the big things. The novel is a satire. Okay, it is a send-up. It's an exaggeration of his world, of the post-World War II. Okay, so he creates this world that has a climate of terror, propaganda, control, power, uniformity, loss of freedoms, etc., etc. So he's exaggerating his own world as a means of commenting on his own society. And the idea is, through the extreme ridiculous or absurdity of some of the exaggerations, he's able to challenge the reader to think about things. The other thing he does too is he uses a lot of allusions, historical allusions. For example, Winston Smith, his name comes from Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, who was the foremost leader of Britain in the war effort, and Smith being the most common surname of the time. And so there are a lot of references to characters like Stalin, and Big Brother's got the moustache on the poster, which I think is a reflection of Stalin, and so he's using satire as a means to make social commentary. The other thing that he's using is speculative fiction. Okay, this is a dystopian novel. We're introduced to a dystopian world, and and that enables him to present a pretty bleak message. One component of speculative fiction is this invented lexicon or neologisms, however you want to talk about that, this invented language. And so there are things like doublethink. The world has these terms, and they come up with slogans like war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And they're contradictory, they're paradoxical in nature, but the purpose of them is to normalise these ideas so that the public, the proles, they are unquestioning. Okay, and if we look at that notion of freedom is slavery, then that's the total opposite, and he's using that, and he's coined these slogans as a way of challenging our thinking. So we think, hang on, well, that's not right, and how can these people blindly accept that? And what that does is it then enables us to challenge our own understanding of our world, our assumptions, and look at the narratives that are presented to us, and we start to think more critically and look at, well, who's determining those and what are their motivations. Newspeak's another interesting one where language and vocabulary is reduced, and in doing that, by having a limited vocabulary or limited language, it reduces individuals' ability to express their desire to rebel. So it's a way of controlling the masses. There's thought crime. There's a whole lot of invented lexicon used to create this statement. From here, what we'll do is now we'll move into some of the other literary devices used in the novel to convey Orwell's ideas. There are many language devices used by Orwell to construct the messages in his novel. Here are some. There are many examples, and obviously we can't go through all of them. It's written from the omniscient third-person point of view, the narration, and occasionally he shifts from that, but most of the time we're able to gain insight into the understandings of characters like Winston through the narrator's perspective as all-knowing. Irony is used a lot in the story. For example, that Winston works for the Ministry of Truth. In what they're doing is they're censoring everything, so their truth is different to our truth. Symbolism is used quite significantly, and I could go on and on for days about this. So birds are symbolic of freedom, and this is associated with Julia and bird song and that type of thing. Room 101 is symbolic of terror, and it's interesting that even today many places, many hotels and things like that won't have room 101 as an actual room because of this novel. 2 + 2 = 5 is about conformity, submission, defeat. So at the end of the novel, or near the end of the novel, when Winston writes that in the dust, we know that he's been defeated, that his rebellion is over. The proles, as a collective, are very unquestioning. They represent uniformity, conformity, that submission. Winston's blue overalls establish this notion of conformity that the regime is setting up. So there are lots and lots of symbols used, and some of them are motifs as well. A motif essentially is a symbol that's been used a number of times throughout a story. So Winston and Julia's love, it was unyielding as water. So water is quite often symbolic for life and for nature, and you'll see it in moments where they escape outside and it's raining, and it is a common trope or trait of literature and art that water is associated with life and love and things like that. There are many allusions in the novel. So here we have a biblical allusion, that is that Emmanuel Goldstein betrays Big Brother. And this is set up like Satan betraying God. We know, though, from reading the novel that O'Brien constructs this story, he makes it up and he writes it into the narrative. And what that does is it provides a focus for the party, an enemy. So Goldstein becomes the party's personification of evil, and in a sense, he is the scapegoat for the ills of the society. And this is a direct reference to the way in which the Nazi Party treated the Jewish race in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and established this climate. And the quote, that Goldstein was the enemy of the people, provides this us and them mentality, and it provides a focus for hatred. And they had those 2-minute hate sessions, and they used that as a tool of propaganda. Certainly, there are many slogans. We looked at a couple before. Things like "Big Brother is watching you." It establishes the fact that the place is a surveillance state, and that's a tool of the propaganda machine and part of the terror. That there are thought crimes and sex crimes, and people are going to dob you in, which reflects the climate of those regimes existing in Europe, particularly at the time. There are metaphors, bigger metaphors, where things like sexual pleasure in the story is associated with defiance or rebellion. That was a form of rebellion. And there are metonyms as well, which are like metaphors in a sense, but it's where one word takes on the association of another. So it's like a euphemism, I suppose, in the sense that I'm being re-educated. When Winston's re-educated, he's tortured in room 101. But it's an interesting use of language. When you're vaporised, that is alluding to death. And that's a nice point to end, I think, that the novel is really looking at the power of language, the power of stories and narratives, that are able to control lives and to dictate people's freedoms and their sense of individuality and their view of the world. And certainly that's a great angle to look at when you're constructing an argument that Orwell is telling a story, and in that telling of the story, he's really looking at the power of language to really control the mindset of a population.